Sometimes the truth waits 20 years for the right table to fall onto. The Blackwell Grand Hotel glowed like a jewel against the cold Manhattan rain, its golden windows reflecting across wet sidewalks while black SUVs lined the curb one after another like silent guards protecting another world. Inside, crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors, and the soft sound of piano music floated through the restaurant where billion-dollar conversations blended with the clinking of wine glasses. Clara Whitmore moved quietly between the tables in her black uniform, balancing a silver tray carefully against her palm while pretending not to notice the people staring at Ethan Blackwell near the center booth. Everyone always stared at Ethan Blackwell. At 38, he was the kind of man financial magazines called untouchable, CEO of Blackwell Holdings, owner of half the skyline downtown, a man whose name appeared on hospitals, museums, and campaign donations. Even seated alone beneath the amber lights, he carried the cold gravity of someone accustomed to control. His charcoal suit looked perfectly fitted. His silver watch caught the chandelier light every time he lifted his hand, and his expression remained fixed somewhere between exhaustion and irritation as he scrolled through messages on his phone without looking at anyone around him. Clara approached his table with practiced calm. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwell," she said softly. "Would you like another coffee?" Ethan barely glanced up. "Black. No sugar." His voice carried the clipped tone of someone who expected obedience more than conversation. Clara nodded once and turned toward the kitchen, but the edge of her worn canvas bag caught briefly against the corner of a chair near his booth. The movement was small, almost nothing, yet something slipped free from the unzipped pocket and fluttered gently through the air before landing face down beside Ethan's glass. Clara froze instantly. Her breath caught for half a second. Ethan noticed the reaction before he noticed the object itself. Slowly, he leaned down and picked it up between two fingers. An old photograph, slightly faded, creased near the edges from years of being handled too often. Clara stepped forward immediately, her composure cracking for the first time. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That belongs to me." But Ethan had already turned the photograph over, and suddenly, the entire restaurant seemed to disappear around him. His eyes locked onto the image. A younger version of his father stood smiling beside a woman Ethan had never seen before. In his arms was a little blonde girl no older than 4, wrapped in a winter coat with tiny white gloves. Snow covered the sidewalk behind them. The little girl was laughing at something outside the frame. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly against the paper, because he recognized the coat. He recognized the scarf around his father's neck. He even recognized the watch his father used to wear every Christmas Eve before he died. But he had never seen the child before. Never. Clara reached for the photograph again, but Ethan pulled it back instinctively. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. His tone had changed now. Not angry. Worse. Controlled. Clara looked around the dining room uneasily, as if suddenly aware that every sound in the restaurant had faded into distant static. "It's my mother's photograph," she answered. Ethan studied her face for the first time. Really studied it. Pale skin, light blue eyes, blonde hair tied back neatly beneath the restaurant's standard black ribbon. There was nothing dramatic about her appearance, nothing designed to attract attention. But now that he looked closer, something about her expression unsettled him. Not fear, not greed, just tiredness. The kind that settles into someone after carrying a secret too long. Ethan lowered his voice. "Who is that little girl?" Clara swallowed carefully. "Me." The word landed softly between them. Ethan stared at her without blinking. Somewhere across the room, a waiter dropped silverware onto a tray, the sharp metallic sound cutting briefly through the silence before fading again. Ethan looked back down at the photograph. On the back, written in dark blue ink that had faded with age, were 6 words. "Someday, tell Ethan the truth." His pulse slowed strangely. Not faster, slower. The way it did before major negotiations, before disasters, before moments that changed everything. "You expect me to believe this?" he asked. Clara's eyes lowered toward the photograph in his hand. "No," she said quietly. "I expected you to hand it back." Ethan leaned backward slowly in the leather booth, studying her with growing suspicion. He had seen this before. People appeared around wealth carrying stories, documents, tears, coincidences. Some wanted money. Some wanted headlines. Some wanted revenge against the Blackwell name itself. His family had spent decades attracting enemies. But this woman didn't fit the pattern. She wasn't emotional enough. That bothered him more than if she had cried. Do you know how many people invent connections to powerful families? Ethan asked coldly. Quite a few, I imagine, Clara replied. Her voice stayed calm. Too calm. And yet you walked directly into my restaurant carrying a photograph of my father. I work here. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Clara finally met his eyes again. I didn't know you'd be here tonight. Rain tapped softly against the tall glass windows behind her while the piano player transitioned into a slower melody near the bar. Ethan looked once more at the little blonde girl in the photograph, then back at Clara. Something deep in his memory stirred faintly. A fireplace. Raised voices upstairs. His mother crying once behind a locked study door when he was 8 years old. He pushed the thought away immediately. Who gave you this picture? He asked. Clara hesitated this time, just long enough for Ethan to notice. My mother, she answered. Before she died. The words settled heavily into the space between them. Clara extended her hand carefully toward the photograph again. Please, she said softly. It's all I have left of her. Ethan looked at the trembling edge of the old paper, then at Clara's face beneath the chandelier light. And for the first time in years, Ethan Blackwell felt something he absolutely hated. Uncertainty. The photograph remained on Ethan Blackwell's desk long after the restaurant closed. Manhattan shimmered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, rain sliding slowly down the glass, while traffic lights bled red and gold across the wet streets below. But Ethan barely noticed the city tonight. The old photograph rested beside his laptop beneath the soft glow of a brass desk lamp, its worn corners casting small shadows across the black marble surface. He had examined it at least 20 times since leaving the hotel restaurant. Every crease, every reflection, every detail hidden behind the smiling faces frozen in time. And each time, the same cold feeling settled deeper into his chest. Because the man in the picture was undeniably his father. Richard Blackwell. Even younger, there was no mistaking him. The posture, the expensive wool coat, the silver watch, the slight scar near his chin from a skiing accident Ethan remembered hearing about as a child. Everything matched. Everything except the little girl. Ethan loosened his tie slowly and leaned back in the leather chair, staring again at the sentence written behind the photograph. Someday, tell Ethan the truth. 6 words. Quiet words. Yet somehow heavier than the boardroom negotiations that moved billions of dollars through his company every quarter. His phone buzzed against the desk. Howard Reed. Ethan answered immediately. Did you find anything? Howard's voice sounded tired. I searched every archived photograph tied to your father from that period. No match. Ethan rubbed his jaw slowly. What about the woman? No public records yet. But there is something strange. Ethan looked toward the rain streaking the windows. Go on. The photograph paper itself. Howard paused briefly. It is authentic. Early 1990s Kodak stock. The ink degradation also matches the age. Silence settled between them for a moment. Ethan hated silence lately. It gave memories too much room to breathe. You think she forged it? Howard asked carefully. Ethan glanced again at Clara's face in his memory. Calm, pale, unshaken. Not once had she pleaded with him to believe her. That part disturbed him most. Real liars usually work too hard. I think she wants something, Ethan replied coldly. Everyone does. But even as he said the words, they sounded weaker than usual. Howard cleared his throat softly. Should I continue digging? Ethan's eyes drifted once more toward the little blonde girl in the photograph. Yes, he said quietly. Find out everything about Clara Whitmore. After the call ended, Ethan remained motionless for several seconds before standing and walking toward the liquor cabinet near the fireplace. He poured a small glass of bourbon but did not drink it. Instead, he stared into the amber liquid while another memory surfaced unexpectedly. He was 9 years old again, standing halfway down the grand staircase inside the old Blackwell estate. His mother's voice echoed sharply through the house behind closed doors. You promised me it was over. Then his father answering something too low to hear clearly. Then silence. Long silence. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. He had not thought about that night in years. The next morning arrived gray and cold over Manhattan. Clara adjusted the sleeves of her black cardigan while walking toward the subway station, her breath visible in the early winter air. The city smelled like wet pavement and burnt coffee from the street carts opening along Lexington Avenue. She kept her eyes down, hands buried in her coat pockets, trying not to think about Ethan Blackwell's expression when he saw the photograph. She had replayed that moment all night, not because she regretted it, but because she recognized something dangerous in his eyes. Recognition. Clara stepped into the crowded subway car as the doors hissed shut behind her. Around her, people stared into phones or carried steaming paper cups while advertisements flickered above the windows. Ordinary morning noise. Ordinary people. She preferred that. Quiet places where nobody asked questions. But her phone vibrated softly inside her pocket. Unknown number. Clara hesitated before answering. Miss Whitmore, a calm male voice asked. Yes. Mr. Blackwell would like to speak with you today. Clara stopped breathing for half a second. Around her, the train rattled beneath the city. I am working tonight, she answered carefully. He knows. Another pause. 7 o'clock. Private dining lounge at the hotel. Clara looked through the subway window at her own reflection. Pale face. Tired blue eyes. Her mother's eyes. Tell him I am not interested in money, she said quietly. The man on the line hesitated slightly before replying. I will pass that along. The call ended. Clara lowered the phone slowly. Across from her, a little girl sat beside her mother wearing bright yellow rain boots while drawing on a napkin with crayons from a diner. Clara stared at the child for a moment too long before looking away. By evening, rain had returned to the city again. The Blackwell Grand Hotel glowed warmly against the storm, while luxury cars lined the entrance beneath massive stone arches. Clara stood outside for several seconds before entering. Her shoes clicked softly across the marble lobby floor as guests drifted past in expensive coats, carrying shopping bags and umbrellas. Everything smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh lilies. Ethan waited inside the private dining lounge near the fireplace. No assistants. No lawyers. Just him sitting alone at a long oak table with the old photograph placed carefully beside a crystal glass of untouched water. Clara noticed immediately that he looked different tonight. Less composed. His tie slightly loosened. Dark circles beneath his eyes. Like someone who had not slept. Ethan stood as she approached. Thank you for coming. Clara remained near the doorway. You said this would be quick. Ethan studied her quietly for several seconds. Then he slid the photograph slowly across the table toward her. I want the truth. Clara looked down at the picture without touching it. The truth is usually disappointing to rich people, she said softly. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. You expect me to believe my father had another child hidden from the entire world? Clara finally lifted her eyes to his. Come again. Too calm. No, she answered quietly. I expect you to believe he tried very hard not to lose us. The fire crackled softly beside them while rain whispered against the tall windows. And for the first time in years, Ethan Blackwell realized he was no longer controlling the conversation. The fire beside the lounge crackled softly, throwing gold light across the dark wood walls while rain drifted down the windows behind Ethan Blackwell like slow-moving shadows. Clara remained standing near the edge of the table, one hand lightly resting against the back of a leather chair as though she still had not decided whether staying here was a mistake. Ethan watched her carefully now, not like a billionaire studying a threat, more like a man trying to solve a memory that refused to fully appear. What do you mean he tried not to lose you? He asked quietly. Clara lowered her eyes toward the old photograph between them. For a moment, she looked very far away from Manhattan, very far away from this polished hotel and its warm lighting and expensive silence. My mother met your father in Boston, she said softly, long before he became Richard Blackwell, the public figure. Ethan said nothing. Clara's voice stayed calm, but her fingers tightened slightly against the chair. She worked at a bookstore near Cambridge. He came in almost every Thursday afternoon. Ethan could almost picture it unwillingly. His father younger, smiling more easily, before the billion-dollar empire, before politics and shareholders and charity galas replaced ordinary things. He told her he was tired of people treating him like a last name instead of a person, Clara continued. She believed him. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. And you expect me to believe my father hid an entire second family? Clara finally looked at him again. No, she answered quietly. I expect you to believe powerful families hide uncomfortable things very well. The words landed gently, but Ethan still felt them. Outside, Thunder rolled faintly above the city while servers moved quietly somewhere beyond the private dining room doors. Clara reached into her coat pocket slowly and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn soft with age. She placed it carefully on the table between them. Ethan unfolded it cautiously. A receipt. Small. Yellowed. Dated 23 years earlier. At the bottom was his father's signature beside the purchase of a silver music box from a boutique in Boston. Ethan frowned slightly. What is this supposed to prove? Clara's expression softened just enough to reveal sadness beneath the calm. Open the photograph. Ethan looked confused for a second before turning the old picture over again. Taped carefully behind it was a tiny brass key he had not noticed before. His chest tightened unexpectedly. Clara nodded toward the receipt. The music box still exists. Ethan stared at her. Where? Clara hesitated briefly. In my apartment. Silence settled heavily between them again. Ethan stood slowly and walked toward the fireplace, one hand sliding into his pocket while his thoughts moved faster than he liked. None of this made sense. Yet every detail felt painfully ordinary in a way lies rarely did. Liars invented dramatic stories. Clara offered tiny details instead. Bookstores. Receipts. Music boxes. Quiet things. Human things. Ethan stared into the fire while another memory surfaced unexpectedly. Christmas Eve. Age 10. His father sitting alone in the library long after midnight, holding a tiny silver object in his hands while soft piano music played somewhere upstairs. Ethan had asked him once what he was looking at. Richard Blackwell smiled strangely and answered, "Something I was supposed to protect better." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. Behind him, Clara spoke again. "My mother never asked him for money." Ethan turned sharply. Clara held his gaze steadily now. "That matters to you, does it not?" He said nothing. "She loved him," Clara continued quietly. "And I think he loved her too. But love becomes very small when powerful people begin making decisions." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You were talking about my family." "I know." Her answer came softly. No anger. No accusation. Somehow that made it worse. Ethan walked back toward the table slowly. "If this is true," he said carefully, "why wait until now?" Clara looked down at the photograph again. "Because my mother spent her entire life believing nobody would listen." The fire cracked loudly beside them. Ethan studied her face under the amber light. Pale skin. Tired eyes. The same controlled stillness he had seen the night before. But tonight he noticed something else beneath it. Grief. Not fresh grief. Old grief. The kind that settled permanently into someone's posture. "She died 6 months ago," Clara said quietly, answering the question he had not spoken aloud. Ethan felt something shift uneasily inside his chest. "Cancer." Clara nodded once. "In the end, she kept asking me one thing." Ethan remained silent. "She wanted me to tell you the truth before the photograph disappeared forever." Ethan looked away immediately toward the rain outside the windows. Manhattan glittered below them, enormous and cold and indifferent. Somewhere in the city, deals were still being signed tonight. Fortunes still moving between buildings. Yet suddenly all of it felt strangely small compared to a faded photograph sitting on a wooden table. "Do you hate us?" Ethan asked unexpectedly. Clara seemed surprised by the question. She thought for several seconds before answering. "No," she said softly. "But I think your family taught my mother that rich people survive by deciding which truths are acceptable." Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. The words should have angered him. Instead, they unsettled him because somewhere deep down, he suspected she might be right. His phone buzzed suddenly against the table. Howard Reed. Ethan glanced at the screen but did not answer. Clara noticed the name immediately. "Your lawyer?" Ethan nodded once. Clara stepped back slightly, already reaching for her coat. "Then I should leave before this becomes a legal conversation." "Wait." The word came faster than Ethan intended. Clara paused near the doorway. Ethan looked again at the old photograph between them, then at the small brass key taped behind it. "I want to see the music box." Clara studied him carefully for several long seconds, as if deciding whether trust was dangerous. Finally, she gave the slightest nod. "Tomorrow night," she said quietly. 7 o'clock. Ethan frowned slightly. "Why not tonight?" Clara opened the dining room door slowly. Warm restaurant noise drifted faintly inside again. Before leaving, she looked back at him one last time. "Because," she said softly, "once you open it, Your family will never be able to pretend I do not exist anymore." Then she disappeared into the hallway, leaving Ethan alone beside the fire with the photograph still resting on the table like a truth that had waited decades to finally be seen. The next day moved slowly for Ethan Blackwell. Meetings blurred together inside glass conference rooms while executives discussed international acquisitions and market projections, but he barely heard any of it. Numbers appeared on giant screens. Lawyers argued softly across polished tables. Assistants handed him folders worth millions of dollars. Yet every few minutes his attention drifted back to the tiny brass key resting inside his jacket pocket. By late afternoon, Manhattan disappeared beneath another curtain of cold rain. Ethan stood alone inside his office overlooking the city while Howard Reed organized documents near the desk. "I ran another search," Howard said carefully. "There is no evidence Clara Whitmore ever attempted contact with your family before now." Ethan stared through the window without responding. No lawsuits. No requests for money. No interviews. Nothing. Howard adjusted his glasses slightly. "If this is a scam, it is a very patient one." Ethan finally turned. "What about her mother?" Howard opened a thin folder. "Her name was Eleanor Whitmore. Worked in Boston during the early 1990s. Bookstore employee. No criminal record. No financial ties to your father that we can prove." Ethan walked back toward the desk slowly. "But—" Howard hesitated. "There were monthly wire transfers made anonymously to her account for almost 4 years." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Amount: $2,000 every month." Ethan felt his stomach tighten unexpectedly. It was not enough money to buy silence. Not enough to hide luxury. Just enough to survive modestly in Boston 20 years ago. Howard continued quietly. "The transfers stopped the same month your father became CEO after your grandfather died." Silence settled across the office. Ethan looked down at the rain sliding across the city outside. Somewhere beneath those gray clouds, Clara Whitmore was finishing another shift carrying trays between tables, while the entire foundation of the Blackwell family quietly trembled beneath her existence. "Do not tell anyone else," Ethan said finally. Howard nodded once. "Not even your mother?" Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "Especially not my mother." Night arrived early beneath the storm clouds. At exactly 7 o'clock, Ethan stood outside a narrow brick apartment building on the Upper West Side, where warm yellow light glowed faintly behind old windows. The neighborhood was quiet. Small grocery stores, coffee shops with fog glass, ordinary people carrying umbrellas through puddles while taxis hissed along wet streets. Ethan checked the address again, even though he already knew it was correct. Clara Whitmore lived here. Not in luxury. Not in secrecy protected by lawyers or security teams. Just here, in a building with chipped paint near the front buzzer. He pressed apartment 4B. A few seconds later, Clara's voice answered softly through the speaker. "You are early." Ethan glanced briefly at his watch. "By 3 minutes." A pause. Then the front door buzzed open. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and laundry detergent. Ethan climbed the narrow stairs slowly, one hand brushing the worn railing, while distant piano music drifted from somewhere inside the building. Apartment 4B opened before he reached it fully. Clara stood in the doorway wearing a cream-colored sweater and dark jeans instead of the black restaurant uniform he was used to seeing. Without the hotel lighting and polished atmosphere around her, she looked younger somehow. Smaller. But her eyes remained the same. Calm. Watchful. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. Ethan stepped inside. The apartment was modest but warm. Soft lamps. Books stacked neatly against the walls. A small piano near the window. Framed photographs arranged carefully across a shelf beside dried flowers in a ceramic vase. Nothing expensive. Nothing performative. Yet the room carried a strange sense of peace Ethan had not felt inside a home for years. Clara noticed him looking around. It is not very impressive by Blackwell standards. Ethan surprised himself by answering honestly. It feels lived in. Something flickered briefly across her face. Almost amusement. Then she walked toward a wooden cabinet near the piano. "My mother liked quiet places," she said softly. "She used to say rich people decorate houses while poor people decorate memories." Ethan remained silent. Clara knelt carefully beside the cabinet and unlocked the bottom drawer with the tiny brass key from the photograph. For a moment, neither of them moved. The rain whispered softly outside the apartment windows while headlights drifted across the ceiling from passing cars below. Then Clara lifted out a silver music box wrapped carefully in faded blue fabric. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs slowly. He recognized it immediately. The tiny engraved roses along the lid. The initials are B carved discreetly underneath. He had seen this music box once before as a child sitting on his father's office shelf before it mysteriously vanished years later. Clara placed it gently on the coffee table between them. "Go ahead," she said quietly. Ethan hesitated before opening the lid. Soft piano music began playing instantly. Slow, delicate, familiar. Ethan froze completely, because he knew this melody. His father used to hum it during long car rides when Ethan was very young. A melody nobody else in the family ever recognized. Ethan lowered himself slowly into the chair beside the table while the music filled the small apartment. "There is more," Clara said softly. She opened another hidden compartment beneath the box and carefully removed a folded letter tied with pale ribbon. The paper looked fragile with age. Ethan stared at his father's handwriting across the front. "Eleanor." His pulse slowed painfully. Clara did not touch the letter again after placing it down. "I have never opened it," she whispered. Ethan looked up sharply. "Why not?" Clara folded her hands quietly together. "Because some truths change shape once you read them aloud." The music box continued its soft melody between them while rain traced silver lines across the apartment windows. Ethan stared at the letter bearing his father's handwriting. And for the first time since this began, he realized he was no longer searching for evidence that Clara Whitmore was lying. Deep down, he was beginning to fear she had been telling the truth all along. The letter remained unopened on Clara's coffee table while the soft melody from the silver music box slowly faded into silence. Ethan sat motionless beside it, one hand resting against his knee while rain tapped gently against the apartment windows. For years, his life had been built on certainty. Numbers, contracts, decisions made quickly and cleanly. But tonight, nothing felt clean anymore. Clara moved quietly toward the kitchen area and returned with 2 cups of tea, placing one carefully beside him without interrupting the silence. Steam curled softly upward beneath the warm apartment lights. Ethan glanced at the cup. "Chamomile." Clara nodded slightly. "My mother believed nobody should hear difficult truths while drinking coffee." Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. Instead, he looked back down at the letter carrying his father's handwriting. "You really never opened it?" Clara wrapped both hands around her tea. "She told me not to." "Why?" Clara's eyes drifted briefly toward the rain outside. "Because she said once certain words become real, people stop pretending." Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. The room smelled faintly of old books and tea leaves and the lavender candle burning near the piano. Small, ordinary things. Yet somehow they unsettled him more than corporate crises ever had. Finally, he reached for the letter. The paper felt fragile beneath his fingers, old enough to belong to another version of his father. Before headlines, before wealth hardened everyone around him into careful performances. Ethan unfolded it slowly. Clara looked away as if giving the memory privacy. Richard Blackwell's handwriting stretched across the page in dark blue ink. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I have already failed both of you." Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. The rain outside seemed louder suddenly. Richard's words continued across the page with quiet honesty that felt almost unbearable. He wrote about Boston, about afternoons inside the bookstore while snow fell outside the windows, about Clara learning to walk while holding onto his fingers, about how Eleanor laughed whenever he pretended not to understand poetry just to hear her explain it again. Ethan stared at the lines in silence while something painful shifted deep inside his chest, because none of it sounded like manipulation. None of it sounded like obligation. It sounded like love. Real love. The kind his father never spoke about at home. Ethan continued reading. "There are people around me who believe legacy matters more than kindness. They think protecting the Blackwell name is worth any sacrifice. But every time I leave Boston, I feel like I am abandoning the only honest part of my life." Ethan lowered the paper slowly. His throat felt tight unexpectedly. Clara remained quiet across from him, eyes lowered toward her untouched tea. "He tried to leave them," she said softly after a long silence. Ethan looked up. Clara's voice barely rose above the rain outside. "Your grandfather threatened to cut him out of the company completely." My mother told him to stay with his family instead. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. His grandfather had built the Blackwell empire with ruthless discipline. Public image mattered more than emotion. Mistakes disappeared quietly. Scandals never survived. Suddenly, Ethan understood why certain subjects had always turned rooms silent whenever he entered as a child. He opened the letter again. Near the bottom, Richard's handwriting changed slightly, as though written in exhaustion. If someday Ethan learns the truth, tell him this was never his fault. Tell him I wanted to know both my children beneath the same sky. Ethan stared at that sentence until the words blurred slightly. Both my children. Clara finally looked at him carefully. You remember him differently than I do, she said softly. Ethan folded the letter slowly. I barely remember him at all. The confession surprised even him. He leaned back against the chair and looked toward the piano near the window. He worked constantly. Every room changed when he entered it. People became careful around him. Clara listened quietly. But there were moments. Ethan continued slowly. Sometimes late at night, he would sit in the library alone listening to piano records. My mother hated when he played them. Clara's eyes softened faintly. My mother loved piano music. Ethan looked at her sharply. That melody from the music box. Clara nodded. He wrote it for her. Silence settled again. Soft. Heavy. Ethan realized suddenly that he had spent his entire life believing wealth revealed the truth about people. Yet tonight, truth sat inside a tiny apartment above a laundromat, while the Blackwell family mansion suddenly felt colder in his memory than ever before. His phone vibrated again across the coffee table. This time it was his mother, Margaret Blackwell. Ethan stared at the screen without answering. Clara noticed immediately. She does not know yet. Ethan shook his head slowly. No, Clara looked down into her teacup. She already knows, she whispered. Ethan frowned slightly. What do you mean? Clara stood quietly and walked toward a small bookshelf near the piano. From the top shelf, she pulled out a faded photograph album and returned carefully to the table. She opened it slowly. Inside were pictures of Eleanor Whitmore through the years. Boston sidewalks. Christmas decorations. Small apartments filled with second-hand furniture. Clara as a child smiling beside birthday cakes. Then Clara stopped at one particular photograph and turned the album toward Ethan. His breath caught instantly. Margaret Blackwell stood outside a church wearing a cream-colored coat and dark gloves. Younger. Elegant. Cold. Eleanor Whitmore stood across from her beneath falling snow, with tears visible even in the faded picture. Ethan stared at the image in complete silence. My mother asked a stranger to take that picture from across the street, Clara said quietly. She said nobody would believe her otherwise. Ethan looked closer. His mother's expression remained perfectly composed in the photograph. But Eleanor looked shattered. What happened that day? Ethan asked softly. Clara closed the album carefully. Your mother offered her money to disappear. The room fell silent except for the rain. Ethan felt something cold move slowly through his chest. Did she take it? Clara looked at him steadily now. Calm again. Painfully calm. No, she answered. That was the problem. The photograph album remained closed between them, while rain continued sliding down the apartment windows in silver lines. Ethan sat very still beside the coffee table, staring at nothing for several long seconds after Clara's final words settled into the room. That was the problem. The sentence echoed quietly inside him because he understood exactly what she meant. The Blackwell family had never known how to handle people who refused to disappear politely. Clara moved toward the kitchen again, giving him space without announcing it. Ethan listened faintly to the sound of running water while his eyes drifted back toward the old photograph album. His mother standing beneath falling snow outside a church. Eleanor Whitmore crying across from her. Two women frozen forever inside a moment Ethan had never known existed. Yet somehow he could already imagine the conversation perfectly. Margaret Blackwell speaking in controlled, elegant sentences. Eleanor trying to protect something love had already made fragile. Ethan rubbed his hands slowly together. They felt cold suddenly. Clara returned carrying fresh tea, but this time she did not sit immediately. Instead, she stood near the window looking down at the glowing street below where umbrellas moved beneath the rain like drifting shadows. My mother hated winter after that day, she said softly. Ethan looked up. Clara's reflection shimmered faintly in the glass beside the city lights. She used to love snow before your family visited Boston. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. You blame us. Clara was quiet for a moment. No, she answered carefully. I blame fear. The apartment fell silent again except for distant traffic outside. Ethan studied her reflection in the window. What happened after the church? Clara finally sat down across from him again, hands wrapped loosely around her teacup. Your father came to see us less often. Her voice remained calm, but Ethan noticed how carefully she chose each word. At first he still called every night, then every week, then mostly letters. Ethan looked toward the folded letter still resting beside the music box. Because of my mother? Clara nodded once. And because your grandfather threatened to remove him from the company entirely if the relationship became public. Ethan leaned back slowly. None of this sounded impossible. That frightened him most. The Blackwell Empire had always protected itself first. Feelings came second. Scandal never survived. Did my father know about the church meeting? Ethan asked quietly. Clara looked down at the steam rising from her tea. Not immediately. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. My mother never wanted him to choose between us and you. Ethan frowned faintly. Why? Clara finally lifted her eyes toward him again. Because she understood something your family never did. Ethan waited silently. Children should not pay for adult pride. The words landed softly, but Ethan felt them like weight against his chest. Somewhere deep inside his memory, another image surfaced unexpectedly. His father standing at the edge of Ethan's 10th birthday party while guests filled the ballroom downstairs. Richard Blackwell had looked distracted all evening. Sad, even. Ethan remembered asking him once if something was wrong. His father smiled faintly and answered, sometimes success costs more than people notice. At the time, Ethan had not understood. Tonight, he suddenly wondered if his father had been thinking about Boston while surrounded by chandeliers and politicians and cameras. Clara reached toward the music box again and carefully wound the small silver key. The soft melody filled the apartment once more. He used to visit on my birthdays, she whispered. Ethan listened quietly. Even after everything changed? Clara nodded. Always briefly. Usually late at night. Her eyes softened slightly with memory. He brought books instead of toys. He said stories lasted longer. Ethan swallowed slowly. His father had done the same for him. Every birthday. Leather-bound novels wrapped carefully in silver paper. Identical rituals lived separately beneath different roofs. The realization made Ethan feel strangely unsteady. Then one year, Clara continued softly. He stopped coming. The melody from the music box slowed slightly as the mechanism weakened. That was the year he died, Ethan said quietly. Clara nodded once. Silence returned again, heavy this time. Shared grief sitting between strangers who suddenly were not strangers anymore. Ethan stood slowly and walked toward the bookshelf near the piano, needing movement more than answers for a moment. His eyes drifted across framed photographs of Clara and her mother through the years. Cheap apartments, small birthday cakes, second-hand Christmas decorations. Nothing luxurious. Yet every picture carried warmth. Real warmth. The kind money often failed to buy. Then Ethan noticed one photograph tucked near the edge of the shelf. Richard Blackwell sitting beside young Clara on a park bench beneath autumn trees. His father was laughing openly in the picture. Not the controlled public smile Ethan knew from magazines and charity events. A real laugh. Ethan stared at it longer than he intended. I have never seen him look like that before, he admitted quietly. Clara walked beside him slowly. My mother used to say people become different when they feel safe. Ethan looked at the photograph again. His father looked younger there somehow. Lighter. Like someone briefly allowed to exist outside expectations. Ethan felt something painful tighten in his chest again. Why are you showing me all this now? He asked softly. Clara was silent for several seconds before answering. Because my mother spent 20 years protecting your family's reputation. She looked toward the rain outside. And in the end, nobody protected her. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Guilt moved quietly through him now. Not because he had caused this, but because suddenly he understood how easily powerful families survived by allowing softer people to disappear around them. His phone buzzed sharply against the coffee table again. This time multiple notifications lit the screen. Missed calls. Messages. Board members asking where he was. His assistant reminding him about tomorrow's investor dinner. The enormous machinery of his life still moving exactly on schedule while everything underneath it quietly shifted. Clara noticed the screen but said nothing. Ethan looked down at the glowing messages for a long moment before silencing the phone completely and placing it face down beside the music box. Clara watched him carefully. Important? She asked softly. Ethan looked around the small apartment once more. The teacups, the photographs, the rain against the windows, the letter in his father's handwriting. Then he answered honestly for the first time in years. Not as much as this. The rain finally stopped sometime after midnight, leaving Manhattan wrapped in silver reflections and quiet streets glistening beneath the streetlights. Ethan Blackwell remained inside Clara's apartment far longer than he intended. Neither of them spoke much after his phone went silent on the coffee table. The music box had stopped playing. The tea had grown cold. Yet neither seemed eager to break whatever fragile understanding had settled quietly between them. Around 1 in the morning, Clara walked him downstairs to the front entrance of the building. The hallway lights buzzed softly overhead, while distant traffic echoed faintly from the avenue beyond the glass door. Ethan adjusted his coat slowly before turning toward her. "Thank you," he said quietly. Clara gave the smallest nod. Most people only thank waitresses after coffee refills. Ethan almost smiled again, but the expression faded quickly beneath the weight inside his chest. "I still do not know what happens now." Clara looked past him toward the wet city streets. "Neither do I." For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan asked the question he had been carrying all night. "Why did you really come to the hotel that night?" Clara lowered her eyes briefly. "I did not." Ethan frowned slightly. Clara looked back at him calmly. "I picked up an extra shift because another server was sick." She hesitated softly. "You were supposed to be in Chicago that evening. Your schedule changed at the last minute." Ethan stared at her in silence. Fate. Accident. Chance. Strange words for a man who normally trusted only strategy and control. Clara stepped backwards slowly toward the stairs. "Good night, Ethan." It was the first time she had used his name without formality. Somehow it felt heavier than everything else said tonight. Ethan stood alone beneath the hallway light for several seconds after she disappeared upstairs. Then he walked out into the cold Manhattan air, carrying a truth his entire life had somehow missed. The next morning, Blackwell Tower buzzed with its usual precision. Assistants crossed polished floors carrying tablets and coffee cups, while financial news played silently across giant screens mounted inside the executive lobby. Yet the atmosphere shifted instantly the moment Ethan stepped out of the elevator. People noticed things about powerful men long before words were spoken. And this morning Ethan looked different. Distracted. Colder somehow. Howard Reed followed him quickly into the office carrying a stack of documents. "The board is asking questions," Howard said quietly after the office doors closed. "You missed 3 investor calls last night." Ethan removed his coat slowly without responding. Howard studied him carefully. "You believe her now." Ethan walked toward the massive windows overlooking Manhattan. "I believe my father was not the man I thought he was." Howard remained silent for a moment. "Those are not always the same thing." Ethan looked down at the city 30 floors below. "Did you know?" Howard hesitated too long. Ethan turned sharply. "Howard." The older man exhaled slowly. "Your father came to me once. About 16 years ago." Ethan's expression hardened instantly. "And?" Howard lowered his voice carefully. He asked how difficult it would be to amend inheritance documents quietly. Ethan stared at him without blinking. "For Clara?" Howard nodded once. But he never completed the paperwork. Silence crashed heavily into the office. Ethan felt something painful shift again inside his chest. "Why not?" Howard's eyes drifted briefly downward. "Your mother found out." Ethan closed his eyes slowly. Outside the windows, helicopters drifted between skyscrapers beneath pale winter sunlight, while the entire city continued moving without caring that another hidden fracture had opened inside the Blackwell family. "There is more," Howard said carefully. Ethan looked back at him. 3 weeks before your father died, he scheduled a private meeting with a trust attorney in Boston. Ethan's jaw tightened. "And?" Howard hesitated. "He never arrived." The room fell completely silent. Ethan remembered that week vividly now. His father had canceled multiple meetings unexpectedly. Margaret Blackwell had seemed furious for days afterward. At the time, Ethan was too young to understand why. But now old memories rearranged themselves quietly into something darker. "You think my mother stopped him?" Ethan said softly. Howard answered carefully. "I think your mother protected the Blackwell name the way she always has." Ethan turned away sharply toward the window again. For the first time in years, he felt angry at his father too. Not because Richard Blackwell loved another family, but because he had lacked the courage to force the truth into daylight while there was still time. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Ethan's assistant stepped cautiously inside. "Your mother is here." Ethan froze slightly. Howard looked toward him carefully. "Should I reschedule?" Ethan stared at the skyline for a long moment before answering. No. Margaret Blackwell entered the office with the effortless elegance that had intimidated politicians and CEOs for decades. Even in her 70s, she moved with perfect posture beneath a cream-colored coat, while diamond earrings caught the afternoon light softly. But the moment her eyes landed on Ethan's face, her expression shifted slightly. Mothers noticed things quickly too. "You look tired," she said calmly. Ethan said nothing. Margaret removed her gloves slowly and glanced toward Howard. "Would you excuse us?" Howard hesitated briefly before leaving the office. The doors closed softly behind him. Silence settled instantly between mother and son. Margaret studied Ethan carefully now. "Something has happened." Ethan walked toward his desk slowly and opened the top drawer. Inside rested the old photograph Clara had dropped onto the restaurant table days earlier. Without speaking, Ethan placed it carefully in front of her. Margaret Blackwell went completely still. Not dramatically, not loudly, just still. Her eyes lowered slowly toward the image of Richard Blackwell holding the little blonde girl beneath falling snow. The color drained almost invisibly from her face. Ethan watched her in silence. For the first time in his life, he saw fear inside his mother's eyes. Real fear. Margaret sat down slowly in the leather chair beside the desk while her gloved fingers trembled faintly against the photograph's edge. She looked older suddenly, smaller somehow beneath the office light. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Ethan's voice remained quiet. "From Clara Whitmore." Margaret closed her eyes briefly as though the name itself carried exhaustion, 20 years old. When she finally looked back up at him, her expression had changed completely. Not anger, not denial. Something worse. Regret. "She found you," Margaret said softly. And Ethan realized immediately his mother had never doubted Clara existed at all. Margaret Blackwell remained seated beside Ethan's desk with the old photograph trembling faintly between her gloved fingers. Outside the windows of Blackwell Tower, late afternoon sunlight faded slowly behind gray winter clouds, while the city below moved through its endless rhythm of traffic and ambition. But inside the office, everything had gone still. Ethan watched his mother carefully. For decades, Margaret Blackwell had controlled every room she entered with effortless composure. Politicians feared disappointing her. Journalists respected her distance. Even Ethan had spent most of his life measuring his words around her. Yet now she looked at the photograph like someone staring at a ghost she had spent 20 years trying to bury. "You knew," Ethan said quietly. Margaret closed her eyes briefly before answering. "Yes." The honesty startled him more than denial would have. Ethan walked slowly toward the windows, hands tightening inside his pockets. All this time, Margaret lowered the photograph carefully onto the desk as though afraid it might break. "Your father told me about Eleanor after Clara was born." Ethan turned sharply. "And you thought hiding them was acceptable?" Margaret looked older suddenly beneath the pale office light. "Do not confuse survival with cruelty, Ethan." His jaw tightened immediately. "There is a difference." Silence stretched between them. Margaret stood slowly and walked toward the windows beside him. The reflection of Manhattan shimmered across the glass behind their faces. "Your grandfather built Blackwell Holdings during a time when scandal destroyed families permanently," she said quietly. "Investors fled weakness. Newspapers fed on private lives. Your father was supposed to become the future of this company." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "So you punished a woman and a child for existing?" Margaret looked down briefly. "I asked Eleanor to leave Boston because I thought I was protecting my family." Ethan let out a cold breath. "And did you ever once wonder who protected hers?" Margaret did not answer immediately. Outside, snow had begun falling lightly above the city, tiny white flakes drifting between skyscrapers. "At first," she said softly, "I convinced myself she would take the money and disappear comfortably." Ethan looked at her sharply, but she refused. Margaret nodded faintly. "That was what frightened me." Ethan remembered Clara's words from the apartment. "Rich people survive by deciding which truths are acceptable." Suddenly, they no longer sounded bitter, just accurate. Margaret moved slowly toward the leather sofa near the fireplace and sat down carefully. "Your father loved her," she whispered. Ethan felt something heavy settle deeper into his chest, hearing the words spoken aloud at last. Margaret stared into the empty fireplace while memories moved quietly across her face. Richard tried ending things many times, but every time he returned from Boston, he looked alive again. Ethan remained silent. "Do you know what it feels like," Margaret continued softly, "to watch the man you built your entire life around slowly belong somewhere else?" Ethan looked away toward the falling snow outside. For the first time in his life, he saw not just his mother, the social icon or business strategist. He saw a woman who had spent decades losing something quietly while pretending otherwise. "I never hated Clara," Margaret said after a long silence. "And I never hated Eleanor." Ethan frowned faintly. "Then why destroy their lives?" Margaret's eyes filled slightly, though no tears fell. "Because I was weak enough to believe love could be controlled if I managed the damage carefully enough." The office fell silent again. Ethan suddenly remembered childhood dinners filled with perfect manners and polished conversations where nobody ever raised their voice. A beautiful family built carefully around things nobody acknowledged. "Did my father stop loving you?" Ethan asked quietly. Margaret looked down at her hands. "No," she answered softly. That was the tragedy. Ethan felt something inside him break slightly at that answer, because now he understood this was never simple betrayal. It was people hurting each other quietly while trying to preserve worlds too fragile to survive honesty. Margaret looked toward him again. Richard wanted to acknowledge Clara publicly before he died. Ethan's heartbeat slowed painfully. "Howard told me." Margaret nodded faintly. "We argued for weeks." She closed her eyes briefly. "Then the night before his trip to Boston, he told me something I have never forgotten." Ethan waited silently. Margaret's voice almost disappeared. "He said money had made us experts at protecting reputations and amateurs at protecting people." Ethan lowered his eyes slowly. Somewhere below the tower, sirens echoed faintly through the city while snow continued falling against the glass. Margaret stood carefully and reached for her coat. "Where is Clara now?" Ethan hesitated slightly. "At her apartment." Margaret nodded once as though she expected the answer. Then she walked toward the office doors before stopping near the entrance. Without turning around, she spoke quietly into the silence. "I owe her an apology she should have received 20 years ago." Ethan watched his mother leave the office slowly, shoulders no longer carrying the same certainty they once had. After the doors closed, he remained alone beside the windows for several long minutes. Snow drifted softly above Manhattan, while his reflection stared back at him from the glass. For most of his life, Ethan believed wealth gave people power over outcomes. But now he understood something far more uncomfortable. Wealth often simply gave people more elegant ways to hide their mistakes. His phone buzzed again against the desk. Another board member. Another investor asking about tomorrow night's annual Blackwell Foundation Gala. Ethan stared at the screen for several seconds before suddenly making a decision that surprised even him. He picked up the phone and called Howard Reed instead. Howard answered immediately. "Ethan." Ethan looked down at the old photograph resting beside his mother's empty chair. Richard Blackwell smiling beside Eleanor beneath falling snow, while little Clara laughed in his arms. A hidden family frozen forever inside a picture too honest to survive inside the Blackwell empire. Ethan's voice remained calm when he finally spoke. "Prepare a statement for tomorrow night." Howard hesitated. "What kind of statement?" Ethan looked toward the city one last time before answering quietly. "The kind my father should have made years ago." Snow drifted softly across Manhattan the following evening, covering the city in pale silence while black cars lined the entrance of the Grand Astoria Ballroom, where the annual Blackwell Foundation Gala unfolded beneath crystal chandeliers and camera flashes. Politicians stepped onto red carpets beside billionaires and celebrities while photographers called names into the winter air. Inside, orchestral music floated through the ballroom where hundreds of guests moved beneath golden light, holding champagne glasses and rehearsed smiles. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Elegant, controlled, untouchable. Yet Ethan Blackwell stood near the entrance feeling as though the entire world around him had quietly shifted beneath his feet. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his posture calm. But tonight the performance no longer fit comfortably. Howard Reed approached him carefully near the stage area. "The board is nervous," Howard whispered. Ethan glanced across the ballroom where executives and donors laughed beneath enormous arrangements of white roses. Good. Howard studied him for a moment. Are you certain? Ethan looked toward the ballroom doors. No. Then his expression softened slightly. But I am tired of pretending certainty is the same thing as truth. At exactly 8:15, the ballroom lights dimmed gently as guests turned toward the stage, expecting another polished Blackwell speech about philanthropy and legacy. Ethan walked slowly toward the microphone while applause rose around him automatically. Years of power had trained rooms to welcome him before he even spoke. But tonight he noticed how fragile applause sounded when built on incomplete stories. Ethan stood beneath the warm stage lights looking out over hundreds of familiar faces. Investors, senators, journalists, family friends, people who had spent decades admiring the Blackwell name without ever asking what had been hidden beneath it. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. The ballroom gradually quieted beneath the soft hum of crystal chandeliers overhead. Then Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed the old photograph. The room remained silent as he placed it gently onto the podium beside the microphone. My father spent most of his life protecting this family's reputation, Ethan began quietly. His voice carried calmly across the ballroom. And I think somewhere along the way, we confused reputation with character. Confused murmurs moved softly through the crowd. Ethan looked down briefly at the photograph before continuing. A few days ago, someone walked into one of my hotels carrying this picture. Several reporters near the back straightened immediately. Ethan ignored them. At first I believed she wanted money. Influence. Something from the Blackwell name. His expression tightened faintly. That assumption says more about me than it does about her. Across the ballroom, Margaret Blackwell sat near the front table wearing a silver gown beneath the chandelier light. Her posture remained composed, but her eyes never left Ethan's face. Her name is Clara Whitmore, Ethan continued softly, and she is my father's daughter. The silence that followed felt enormous. Not dramatic, just stunned. Forks stopped moving against plates. Conversations disappeared instantly. Somewhere near the back of the room, a glass shattered softly against the marble floor. Ethan stood still beneath the lights while shock moved quietly through the ballroom like cold wind. Cameras remained lowered. Even reporters seemed uncertain whether to interrupt the moment. Ethan's voice softened further. For 20 years, she and her mother carried a truth this family was too afraid to acknowledge publicly. His eyes drifted briefly toward Margaret. And fear has a way of making good people do unforgivable things quietly. Margaret lowered her gaze slowly. No denial came. No interruption. Only silence. Ethan continued carefully. Clara never asked for money. She never threatened anyone. She never tried to expose our family. He paused briefly. She only carried an old photograph because it was all her mother had left. The ballroom remained completely still now. Ethan looked across the sea of wealthy faces before him. People who spent their lives protecting appearances while ordinary kindness quietly disappeared behind contracts and headlines. Last night, Ethan said softly, I sat inside a small apartment above a laundromat listening to a music box my father bought for another family he loved. His voice nearly broke on the word loved, but he steadied it carefully. And for the first time in years, I realized wealth does not protect people from regret. Sometimes it only gives regret better furniture. A few guests lowered their eyes. Others stared motionlessly toward the stage. Near the ballroom entrance, Clara Whitmore stood quietly in a dark blue dress beside the doorway. She had arrived unnoticed minutes earlier after Ethan's assistant personally invited her. Snow still melted slowly against the shoulders of her coat, while soft ballroom light touched her pale hair. Ethan saw her immediately. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Clara looked uncomfortable standing there beneath so many watching faces. Yet she did not run. She simply stood calmly the way she always had. Quiet. Steady. Ethan stepped away from the podium slowly. My father once wrote that children should not inherit the consequences of adult pride. His eyes remained on Clara now. I think he was right. Then, in front of the entire ballroom, Ethan walked down from the stage and crossed the room toward her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The sound of his shoes against marble echoed softly beneath the chandeliers while cameras finally began flashing carefully around them. Ethan stopped in front of Clara near the ballroom entrance. Up close, she looked overwhelmed by the attention, but her expression remained composed beneath it all. Ethan reached into his pocket once more and carefully handed her the old photograph. "It belongs with you," he said quietly. Clara looked down at the picture for a long moment before answering softly. "My mother would have hated all this attention." Ethan almost smiled sadly. "Mine too." For the first time since this began, Clara's expression softened into something close to peace. Not victory, not satisfaction, just release. Around them, the ballroom remained silent beneath the falling snow outside the windows. Then Margaret Blackwell slowly stood from her table across the room. Every eye turned toward her immediately. The older woman walked carefully through the crowd until she stopped in front of Clara. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Margaret removed one white glove slowly and reached for Clara's trembling hand. "I am sorry," she whispered. The words were almost too quiet to hear, but somehow they carried farther than every speech given in that ballroom for the last 20 years. Clara looked at the older woman standing before her, the woman who had once tried to erase her existence to protect a perfect family image. And instead of anger, Clara only looked tired, gently tired. "My mother waited a very long time to hear that," she answered softly. Margaret's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. Outside, snow continued falling over Manhattan while inside the ballroom, something much rarer finally arrived. Not perfection, not power, just truth spoken aloud before it became too late.